Pelosi thought she was dealing with another inexperienced newcomer. But Karoline's response was so composed, so direct, it flipped the entire conversation on its head. It was a Wednesday morning in Washington, damp, gray, and tense. The kind of air that made your clothes feel heavier than they were, Michelle. In the sleek glass studio of Daylight America, the producers were counting down the seconds. Everything looked calm on camera, but behind the scenes, everyone knew this segment might go off the rails. Karoline Leavitt sat tall in her chair, posture firm but relaxed, 20-something, quick-minded, and already branded by many as too ambitious too soon. She knew what she was walking into. This wasn't her first interview, but it was her most important. Across from her, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi adjusted her lapel mic with the ease of someone who'd been doing this longer than Karoline had been alive. Her tone off air was polite, even friendly. But once the red light turned on and the host gave his welcome, everything changed. 2 minutes in, the conversation turned sharp. The topic was youth and politics, leadership readiness, and whether fresh faces actually meant fresh ideas. And then, Pelosi leaned forward just slightly, her voice soft but surgical. With all due respect, I see another media-trained mouthpiece with no grasp of real leadership or sacrifice. The words sliced through the air like they were rehearsed. The host flinched. A producer in the control room mouthed, "Oh no." But Karoline didn't blink. The silence that followed was deafening. For half a second, you could hear someone in the studio breathe in too sharply. The cameras didn't cut. The host tried to pivot with a nervous chuckle. "Well, that's certainly one way to look at it." But no one was laughing. Karoline turned her head slowly toward Pelosi, just enough to meet her eyes without looking confrontational. And then she smiled. It wasn't smug. It wasn't forced. It was the kind of smile that comes from holding something stronger than anger. "Congresswoman," Karoline said, voice calm and steady, "I respect your decades in politics. But dismissing someone based on their age or how new they are to the game is exactly why people stop trusting Washington." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. Instead, she took a breath, glanced at the host, and continued. "You may see a media-trained mouthpiece, but what millions of Americans see is someone who worked 2 jobs, paid off their own student loans, and stepped up. Not because I wanted power, but because I got tired of people like you making leadership feel like a private club." Pelosi blinked. The host leaned back in his chair, letting it happen. "You say I don't understand sacrifice," Karoline added, "but maybe that's the problem. Maybe you've forgotten what real sacrifice looks like when it's not measured in political capital." That was the moment everything shifted. The control room didn't cut to commercial. Phones in viewers' hands across the country lit up with screen recordings. It was raw. It was live. It wasn't polished. But it felt real. The tension didn't drop. Pelosi sat quietly. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands, usually folded, now rested apart on the table. The host cleared his throat and fumbled for the next question, something safer, something about economic recovery. But by then, the segment had already carved itself into internet history. But what the cameras didn't catch was the weight Karoline carried after the segment ended, and how that pressure would follow her the moment she stepped off the set. The second the cameras cut to commercial, the room shifted. A low murmur filled the air as stage crew moved about, half pretending nothing unusual had happened. The host stood and stretched, clearly relieved. Pelosi remained seated, her lips pursed tight, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the studio walls. Karoline, meanwhile, reached for her water without rush or apology. She wasn't shaking, but her fingers were stiff. Her heart was beating hard, too hard, but on the outside, nothing showed. That smile she gave on camera, it came from years of learning when to hold her ground and when to let someone else trip on their own ego. A young assistant with a clipboard walked up and quietly told her she had 5 minutes before her car arrived. Karoline nodded, stood up, and thanked the crew on her way out of the studio. She could feel eyes on her, some impressed, some cautious, others probably irritated that she hadn't followed the unwritten rule of defer to your elders. But she had no regrets, just thoughts, lots of them. In the elevator down to the lobby, Karoline finally pulled out her phone. 200 messages, 5 missed calls. She didn't read any of them, not yet. Her reflection in the metal elevator doors looked composed, but she knew what was coming. This moment would either define her or bury her. Nothing in between. Outside, the city was waking up. Her driver held the back door open, and as she slid into the black sedan, she exhaled deeply. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, unsure whether to ask how it went. He didn't have to. "That bad, huh?" he said, half joking. "Worse for her," Karoline replied, not smiling this time. As they pulled away from the studio, her phone buzzed again. A text from her mother. "Saw it live. You kept your composure. That's all that matters." She stared at it for a second, then turned the phone face down in her lap. The ride back to her hotel was only 10 minutes, but the weight of what had just happened made it feel like a long, slow crawl through something much bigger than a political disagreement. It was generational, cultural, personal. Karoline knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Up in her room, she took off her blazer, kicked off her heels, and finally checked the headlines. Leavitt levels Pelosi. Young Republicans calm clapback stuns morning viewers. A new voice in an old room. She read none of the articles. The headlines told her all she needed, but more than that, she knew the next part would be trickier. The internet loved viral moments, but politicians, they loved to spin them. She opened her group chat with her team. It was a mess of texts, call requests, screenshots, and a few celebratory memes. But at the very bottom, her campaign manager had typed just one sentence. "We need to decide. Do you want to ride the wave or change the conversation?" She stared at that question for a long time, because there's a big difference between going viral and standing for something. That's when a knock came at her door. It was her assistant, Nina, holding a tablet and wearing the same anxious face she wore during campaign nights. Nina stepped inside without waiting for an invite. "It's already everywhere," she said. "We've got reporters asking for statements, 3 radio show invites, and a few networks begging for you to appear tonight." Karoline stood by the window, staring down at the city below. "I didn't plan that moment, Nina," she said quietly. "Exactly why it worked," Nina replied. "It was honest." Karoline turned, finally facing her. "Honest gets twisted. They'll find ways to make it look like I was disrespectful." "Then let them," Nina said, setting the tablet down, "because for once, they're not controlling the story." But just because the narrative shifted didn't mean it was in her hands yet, and the next move would matter more than anything she'd said on air. That evening, the producers of Daylight America uploaded a clip of the interview to their official channel. No cuts, no commentary, just the full, unfiltered exchange. Within the first hour, it hit over 1 million views, and by nightfall, it was everywhere. Shared by friends who never talk politics, dissected by pundits who usually ignored newcomers, and looped endlessly across news networks. But Karoline wasn't watching. She was in a quiet room inside a modest office building in Manchester, New Hampshire, surrounded by her core team. No suits, no polished advisors, just 4 people in hoodies, tapping away at laptops, trying to stay ahead of a moment that none of them planned. The room buzzed with ideas, statements, follow-ups, whether she should accept the evening interview requests or let the moment breathe. "You've already won the day," said Jonah, her campaign manager, pacing near the window. "You don't need to do anything tonight. Let the press stew in it. Tomorrow morning we hit with clarity." "No," Karoline said, eyes locked on her notepad. "Tonight people are listening now. I need to speak while it's still real." She stood, took a breath, and walked over to the small camera setup they'd used during her early campaign live streams. It wasn't fancy, just a ring light and a mic. But it had always worked before, and it would work now. They clicked go live. She appeared on screen, calm but serious. No makeup retouches, no teleprompter. "Hi everyone," she began. "Today I was called a mouthpiece, someone with no grasp of leadership, and that's okay. People are allowed to think that. But I want to explain why I stayed calm, why I didn't fire back in anger." She paused for a second, let her breath settle. "I've worked since I was 15. My dad ran a towing business. My mom worked nights. They didn't teach me to chase microphones. They taught me to show up, to fix problems, to speak honestly, even if it makes you unpopular. So when someone dismisses me on national television, I don't take it personally. I take it as a reminder of why I'm here. I'm not in this to be liked. I'm here because too many people feel unheard, and too many leaders think experience is a license to belittle. Her voice wavered for just a second, not from nerves, but from something deeper. You don't need a decades-long resume to care. You don't need approval from Washington to lead. You just need conviction and respect. That line hit. Thousands of comments started to pour in, not just from supporters, but from independents, and even self-described liberals who said, I don't agree with her politics, but she handled that with class. I'm not perfect, she continued. I've made mistakes. I'm still learning, but I won't accept the idea that new voices don't matter. That respect only flows one way. She looked directly at the camera. To every young person who's been told to sit down, wait your turn, or earn your stripes, I hear you. But know this, speaking up doesn't mean you're disrespectful. It means you care enough not to stay silent. Then she ended the live stream. No drawn-out sign-off, no applause in the room, just silence, in a strange calm that filled the space right after. Jonah let out a breath. That was better than anything I could have written, he said. It wasn't a script, Karoline replied. It was the truth. But truth alone wasn't going to protect her, because while some people praised her, others were already sharpening their knives, and the real storm was just beginning. By dawn, Karoline's words had become more than a moment. They were a movement. News anchors across the country, from Sacramento to Tampa, replayed her response side by side with Pelosi's jab. Some networks labeled it a generational clash. Others framed it as a rebuke of elitism. But what stood out wasn't just the political spin, it was how ordinary people were talking. In a small diner in Fort Worth, Texas, two women in their 60s, both retired school teachers, watched the clip on an iPad over breakfast. She didn't flinch, one of them said. Reminded me of when we first started teaching, the other replied. Had to stand your ground without raising your voice. On a college campus in Columbus, Ohio, a group of students debated the exchange in a journalism class. One student leaned forward, arms crossed. I don't even agree with her platform, she said, but she handled that with more grace than half the people were told to admire. Online, the clip tore through every social platform. TikTok edits, Instagram reels, YouTube commentaries. Even Twitter, noisy, hostile Twitter, showed something strange. Bipartisan respect. Had Karoline Speaks trended for over 14 hours. But not everyone was impressed. Some dismissed her as performative. Others tried to reframe the exchange as rude, arrogant, or scripted. An op-ed in a Boston paper accused her of being media-savvy but hollow. A well-known commentator tweeted, politeness doesn't equal substance. Karoline saw it all, but she didn't respond, not yet. Meanwhile, her team's inbox flooded. Invitations, requests, support, criticism, threats. It was the messy intersection of attention and risk. Then came something unexpected. A voicemail, no caller ID, but the voice was unmistakable. Karoline, this is Senator Raines. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened yesterday, and I may not be in your party, but that was the first time in a while I've seen someone respond with actual principle. Hold your line. Raines, a name with weight, a centrist figure respected on both sides. Karoline played the message twice, then sat in silence. What now? Jonah asked from across the table, holding his phone like it might explode. We don't chase this, she said. We don't spin it. We use it. He looked confused. Use it how? To talk about tone, she said, about why people are exhausted by leaders talking over each other. That afternoon, she scheduled a town hall, not in Washington, not on a flashy set, but in a modest community center in Fargo, North Dakota. No one knew why she picked Fargo, but that was the point. She walked in wearing jeans and a blazer. No cameras, except for one live streamer in the back. Just folding chairs, coffee, and a crowd of 200 curious citizens. She took questions, thanked critics for showing up, and when one man stood and said, "Why didn't you just tear into her? Why be polite?" She answered without blinking, "Because I wasn't raised to humiliate people to win points. I was raised to make my point and leave with my dignity." The room got quiet, then it clapped, not loudly, not with spectacle. Just a few hands at first, then the rest followed. But while Karoline kept things grounded, Pelosi's side was scrambling with backlash of their own, and the next twist was about to shift the conversation once again. Across the country, headlines kept multiplying, but inside Pelosi's camp, silence was the strategy for now. Her team hoped the news cycle would move on, that Karoline's fire would burn fast and disappear. But it didn't. By Friday morning, respected columnists were weighing in. One article in the St. Louis Gazette ran the headline, "The Power of Restraint, How a Young Candidate Redefined Political Discourse in Under 2 Minutes." Another in the Portland Register read simply, "Pelosi missed the moment, and America noticed." Inside Pelosi's office, the mood was tense. Her senior aide, Alan Cresswell, had spent 2 nights monitoring sentiment and pulling quotes. Some staffers wanted her to issue a clarification. Others pushed for silence. But Pelosi, ever strategic, waited. "If I address it, I make it bigger," she said, scrolling through her tablet. "It already is bigger," Alan said. "You underestimated her, and people saw it." She looked up, weary but measured. "Then maybe it's time to stop underestimating her." Meanwhile, Karoline was on her 4th coffee of the day, running on very little sleep. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Her inbox had crossed 10,000 unread messages. And her team was now fielding interview requests from outlets that had never given her the time of day before. But in between the noise, there were moments that stood out. Like the email from a high school civics teacher in Tulsa. "Today we watched your response in class. We talked about how disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. Some of my students changed how they see politics because of you." Or the handwritten letter from a 78-year-old woman in Helena, Montana who wrote, "I didn't vote for your party, but I saw myself in the way you held your ground without spitting fire. You reminded me of what politics used to feel like." Karoline read that one twice. Late that night, she sat alone in her hotel room, scrolling through the messages. The adrenaline had started to fade. The pressure, however, hadn't. This moment could cement her or crush her under expectations. Either way, she was in it now. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello?" A pause, then a man's voice. Steady, warm. "Karoline, this is Dwight Ames." She stood up, startled. Dwight Ames, the former governor of Ohio, a political icon. He hadn't been active in public life for almost a decade. "Governor, I didn't expect—" "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I just wanted to tell you, I watched, and I listened. And if my granddaughter ever decides to get into politics, I hope she has your kind of backbone." That was real leadership. Karoline didn't know what to say. She finally muttered, "Thank you, that means a lot." "Don't let them change you," he added. "The pressure will come from all directions, but stay sharp, stay calm, and never confuse applause with purpose." Click. She sat back down, staring at the dark phone screen, thinking about his last words. Never confuse applause with purpose. She wrote that down. But while Karoline was finding unexpected support from unlikely corners, something else was brewing behind closed doors. Pelosi was preparing a response of her own, and this time it wouldn't come in the form of an insult. Sunday morning arrived with a headline no one saw coming. Pelosi to address generational tensions in exclusive Sunday sit-down. The show? Nation View, one of the most watched political programs in the country. The host, Leonard Fields, known for his sharp questions and even sharper memory, didn't waste time. 5 minutes in, he pulled up the clip of the now infamous exchange between Pelosi and Karoline. Pelosi watched it without interruption, her hands folded. Her eyes didn't flicker. But when it ended, Fields leaned in. "Congresswoman, do you still stand by your words?" She took a breath. "I stand by my belief that experience matters," she said. "But I also believe I mishandled that moment." Fields raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying you regret the comment?" "I'm saying I underestimated her," she said. "And that's not something I do lightly." It wasn't a full apology, but it wasn't nothing. Social media exploded again. Not because she doubled down, but because she didn't. Some called it backpedaling. Others called it maturity. Either way, it kept the story alive. Back in Manchester, Karoline was watching from her hotel suite. The volume was low, but the meaning was loud. Jonah stood by the window, arms crossed. "Well, that's a twist." Caroline didn't respond at first. She sat still, taking it all in. It was a surreal moment, being acknowledged by someone who had once waved her off as irrelevant. She's not used to being the one who misjudged, she finally said. This wasn't her plan. So what do you do? Jonah asked. I talk, but not about her. The next day, Caroline held a public Q&A in Flagstaff, Arizona, another unflashy location. Folding chairs, local press, no podium. She stood at eye level with the people in the room and opened with a different tone. This week's been a lot, not just for me, but for a lot of folks watching from home. So let's talk about why it mattered. She went on to explain how political debate has become less about solutions and more about spectacle. How it wasn't just about Pelosi's comment, it was about a system that rewards interruption over listening. One woman, probably in her late 50s, raised her hand during the Q&A. Why do you think your response hit people the way it did? She asked. Caroline paused, then said, because people are tired of being talked down to. I didn't yell. I didn't clap back. I just stood my ground. And people saw themselves in that. After the event, a local reporter asked if she had anything to say directly to Pelosi. No, Caroline said. She's had her career. I'm focused on mine and on the people I represent. That's who I'm speaking to. It wasn't a jab. It was a line in the sand. That night, a new headline ran on cable news. A new era of politics. Young leader gains respect across party lines. And in private, even longtime insiders began to ask the same question. Was this the beginning of a shift? Caroline had started as a lightning rod, a name mentioned with skepticism, but now she was something else entirely. Proof that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits for the room to quiet down, and then speaks with purpose. But even as the dust began to settle, Caroline knew something deeper had changed, and soon she'd have to face what that change would demand from her next. 2 weeks later, Caroline found herself in a quiet room backstage at a community college in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The event was small, not televised, just a round table with students, local leaders, and a few reporters seated discreetly at the back. It was a different kind of room, one where people weren't looking for sound bites, they were looking for sincerity. She sat at the center of a horseshoe-shaped table, surrounded by young adults from different backgrounds. No prepared speeches, just conversation. A student named Luis leaned forward. Everyone's talking about how you kept your cool, but weren't you mad? I mean, how did you not snap? Caroline smiled, not the camera-ready kind. This one was real. Tired, maybe, but grounded. Of course I was mad, she said, but I wasn't surprised. You expect people to doubt you when you're new, when you look different, sound different, or take a different path. She paused. What mattered wasn't how I felt. It was what I chose to do with that feeling. The room was still. No one checked their phones. If I had clapped back the way people expected, we'd be talking about a fight, not a message. And I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to shift the way we have them. That hit home. One of the professors scribbled something in a notebook. A few students exchanged glances. Caroline continued. We talk a lot about strength in politics, but strength isn't about who talks loudest. It's about knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when to listen, especially to the people who don't agree with you. Outside, the sun was starting to set. She could see the shadows stretching long across the pavement through a small window in the hallway. She stood, took a step back from the table and looked at the group. I didn't respond calmly because I'm soft. I did it because I know what it's like to be dismissed. I've seen people shut down instead of speak up, and I want to build something where they don't have to shrink just to be heard. Afterward, as she made her way to the parking lot, her assistant Nina caught up with her, carrying a folded piece of paper. Someone handed this to me on the way out, she said. Caroline unfolded it. A single sentence was written in neat handwriting. Thank you for showing my daughter that being respectful doesn't mean being silent. She folded it again, placed it in her coat pocket. In the car, silence filled the space between her and Nina, but it wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. After a while, Nina asked, "What do you think happens next?" Caroline looked out the window, then back down at her hands. Honestly, she said, I think we have a chance, not to fix everything, but to remind people how to start. Because in the end, the viral clip wasn't the victory. The victory was in the shift it sparked, the conversations at kitchen tables, the kids who asked better questions in class, the older generations who paused before dismissing someone new. It wasn't about Pelosi or the insult or even the comeback. It was about showing that you don't have to match disrespect with disrespect, that there's another way, a harder way, but a better one. Karoline didn't just stand up for herself that day. She opened a door. And once people see that door, it's hard to pretend it doesn't exist. So if you're watching this and you've ever been overlooked, spoken over, or told to wait your turn, remember this. You don't have to yell to be heard. You don't have to stoop low to stand tall. Let your words carry weight, not heat. And when your moment comes, speak with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for doubt. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, share it, and keep the conversation going. Because how we speak to each other says everything about the kind of future we're building.